Welcome. I think because so many of you are made the effort to be here on time, we won't. We'll fuzzily move into Berkeley time here and get started. So for those of you who I don't have the good fortune to know, I'm Torsten Malczak. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and welcome to one of our Commons conversations. We have started this series of conversations this year around the role of technology and media in public life. When we decided to start these conversations, these are working instrumental conversations on that we believe are incredibly important at a time when the role of technology and social media, information and disinformation have reached a kind of unexpected and unanticipated fervor in their shaping of American political life and public discourse. So, as the Center for New Media at one of America's greatest, we would say, public institutions, we felt this was a very important thing for us to tackle head on. When I was conceiving of this series, this is a kind of opportunistic series based on people who are local or happen to be in the area, et cetera, a kind of adaptive ecology, as it were, of trying to figure out who's around who can help us think about this. If the thought literally went through my head, if only we could get Adam Greenfield to come and have one of these conversations, but Adam is, while was once, is now a Londoner, and so he said, but not probably 10 days or 2 weeks after I had that thought, I got an email from Adam saying, hey, I'll be around. And so I immediately leapt on the opportunity to secure his presence here with us today for this conversation. Adam will be presenting from his most recent book, just as a technically legal ask.
Not yet.
Not for another month, which is precisely on the role of technology in public life. And I've known and admired Adam for a long time. Since I started to become involved in conversations about cities and technology 6 or 7 years ago, I have consistently admired Adam's voice as one of the strongest, clearest, and most vocal advocates for cities and public life in a conversation about technology. The conversation is so much in this world the other way around. The conversation about what technology can do to cities versus what cities can teach technology. So I really appreciate Adam's work, and I'm so delighted to have him here with us. Adam is now living and working in London as, amongst other things, a lecturer at the Program of Urban Design at the Bartlett, of which I'm now officially also an external examiner, so I'm very happy to welcome him here to Berkeley, and I look forward to our conversation today. Adam will give a presentation, and then we'll open it up to a conversation between both him and me, and all of you as well. So keep your pencil sharpened, and we look forward to it.
Wow. Well, thanks for the extraordinary warm welcome, Dave. This looks back in nice.
Yes.
It's fantastic to be back in Berkeley, in a very, very part of the world that's very special to me. And I've never actually spoken here, which is really weird. This is like the first time back, in a sense. So, wow, it's a fantastic job. The talk today is, it's like 17 talks in one, honestly. So, we're going to race through a lot of fairly dense material. And that's kind of deliberate in that Nick had asked me to sort of spark conversations. There are any number of pivot points in the next hour or so worth of material that will engage questions of what it means to be a subject of network digital information technology in the early 21st century. How that limits our agency, how we can try to wrest back some control for ourselves, how we can involve ourselves in the design of the systems that do so much to condition our everyday life, and in fact our life changes. Nick has already given you sort of the overview, but I kind of want to present my bona fides, if you let me. I've written a couple of books in the space, broadly speaking, space where network digital information technologies meet everyday life, particularly everyday life. Every day, everywhere, the dawning of ubiquitous computing in 2006, about 10 years ago now. A small pamphlet called Urban Computing and Its Discontents. Something I'm very proud of, a pamphlet called Against the Smart City, which came out a couple of years ago, ahead of the discourse around the smart city. And most recently, this book, Rapid Technologies, which we'll talk today. But I want to get across the idea, it isn't simply that I thought about the semantic or the rhetorical space around these technologies. I've actually built them as well in a succession of positions, ranging from originally my involvement in information architecture and the structural and navigational design of complex informational spaces, straight through to the engineering of RFID-based interaction models for kind of stereotypical urban situations like, you guys still have Clipper cards here? You ever wonder how much money is left on your Clipper card? So you ever run into the turnstile and you're like, damn, I only have 20 cents left on my Clipper? Okay, so this was something we designed to get around that. It was, we made it a non-volatile e-paper display to an RFID card, and it turns out that you don't need any more onboard power than that. It turns out that the coil, the RFID coil itself, draws enough power so that you can energize a display that tells you how much money you have left on your card or how long it has to expire. So we actually built this as a prototype with my former practice. We did a bunch of other things as well. These interactive high-resolution visual cartography kiosks for the city of Helsinki and the city of Chicago. And I kind of feel like reality overtook us on this. And, you know, in an interesting way, this makes my argument for me against me, in that all the time the designers of digital technologies are overtaking our arguments. And in this case, it turns out that people have these maps on their smartphones all the time anyway. Now, we had a real digital divide concern. We had a concern that not everybody in the city would have access to those maps. But it turns out that if even 70% of the adult population when they enter a city has a map like this in their pocket, the powers that be, the good and the great, are really looking to invest in what it takes to deploy a network of 100 or so kiosks. So that's one channel of practice that's taught me much of what I know about what I write about in my books. But there's another channel as well, which is activism. The image on the screen is an image from Occupy Sandy, the disaster relief and recovery operation that was founded on explicitly horizontalist and anti-oppressive tenets that sprung up in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. That I was involved with in the most humble of ways, literally as sort of a picking and packing person, sorting incoming donations into the pews of the church that we were using as our disaster relief and recovery hub. And all this is to say that I sit at a fairly privileged place, which is the intersection of theory and practice. And, you know, I have to say that in maybe the 150 years since he spoke these words, very few people have articulated that the stakes at the hinge of theory and practice more articulated than good old Karl Marx, who we see here buried in Highgate Cemetery. And on top of his gravestone is the workers of the world, you have nothing, you have unite, you have nothing to lose with your chains quote. And that's the one that people really generally focus on. But if you look at the base, there's a quotation from the Theses on Feuerbach, which I find infinitely more fascinating and interesting to me. Almost equally famous. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. But the point, however, is to change it. And I think in our time, fewer, as a class, as a group of people, fewer people have taken this charge more personally to heart than a cohort that might have surprised Marx, the technologists, the information technologists, particularly information technologists, that have been working for the last 4 years or so in and around this very I think of, in particular, a guy named Alan Kay, a visionary, a man of enormous heart, who was working for many, many years at the Xerox PowerOpera Research Center. And, you know, you might be familiar with something Alan Kay would say. So the best way to predict bound up in that, which is that you can actually make interested, purposive interventions in the world and kind of see the purpose behind those interventions carried through. That you can actually invent technologies that therefore carry your values forward into the world. And he makes this proposition at a really, really interesting time, a time of high-flying idealism. I mean, this is what Alan Kay looked like when he said that. This is Alan Kay at Xerox PARC, which was not just a corporate R&D facility. It was a place that I think, as sincerely as possible, within the limits of the discourse that was operating at that time, really did believe that the way to improve technology was to develop it not merely in concert and collaboration, but with the active participation of artists and philosophers and people who are sort of external to the engineering conversation. And some of the values that were alive in the Bay Area of the late 1960s and early 1970s were extraordinary, were things that, to this day, despite the fact that, I've kind of had to problematize them, and they ought to have been, and in fact were properly problematized, they still have the power to inspire me in a lot of ways. We look at, for example, the Whole Earth Catalog of 1968 with its focus on access to tools and information. The notion that by demystifying and decentralizing access to powerful technologies, that people could liberate themselves from the structures of oppression they lived under. The idea that information technology particularly could be used in large-scale deliberations. This is the control room of Project CyberSyn, something that the great British cybernetician Stafford Beer built for the government of Salvador Allende in 1972. This was supposed to be the nerve center of the entire nation, where information about supply and demand, economic flows, material flows, energetic flows was brought into one place, not for a command and control decision, but as the layout of the room indicates, a conversation, a discussion, a debate between priorities. It was a contested space, and it was designed to be that way. Challenges to power were implicit in a lot of the technological decentralization at this time. This is the Ant Farm's mobile media ban. I'm going to read you what it says here. It says, Ant Farm video reveals the candidates for mayor and supervisor in San Francisco in 1970, interviewed by Shelley Serpin as they talk about Proposition P, which is the one which was trying to circumvent the Manhattanization of San Francisco, and we all know how that worked out in the end. But this was Ant Farm. This was Ant Farm and their mobile media technology ban around 1970. Another one of the values that was really important that was beginning to be articulated in the Bay Area and elsewhere at that time was the importance of collectivity. This is an illustration from an amazing book, which in fact gives my book sort of its title and inspiration. This was a sort of the British equivalent of the Whole Earth Catalog, a huge book called Radical Technology, which was about how to repurpose and adapt and reuse the highest technology available at the time for things like global power generation. The centerpiece of this book were these 6 extraordinary illustrations by an anarchist illustrator named Clifford Harper, which were kind of, they're called the visions. There were 6 of them. And they were really detailed imaginings, visual contributions to the visual imaginary about what it would look like when technology had been captured by El Pueblo, the people. Importantly, in his illustrations, you almost always see women doing this. This is not the Californian ideology in its original form. This is its Californian ideology in its sort of transatlantic, right on, more overtly political form. And then if you come back to the Bay Area, you see the emphasis on DIY through the Homebrew Computer Club. You might recognize these stoned individuals. And I assure you they're stoned in this image. In the launch of their project, the Apple One. And I think we all know what happened with that. The values that were expressed in these interested, purposive interventions would have remade the world in a way that some people would have found highly congenial. It wouldn't have been paradise, nothing ever is. It wouldn't have been utopia, nothing ever is. But these currents were all alive in that moment. And the trouble is, to sort of argue and push back against Alan Kay, they did. They wanted to predict the future by inventing it, but something else happened. Something else happened instead. And I would characterize that something else as wallpapered with bullshit IP law, where, for example, you can see here, this is Amazon's patent on the white background for commercial product photography. This was actually awarded to them. Walled gardens, so places, if you have an operating system and you have applications that work with that operating system, you are essentially limited to that corporate universe and the discretion of the overseers of that garden. Rent-seeking behavior. This is a guy named Nathan Norvold who made his millions at Microsoft and then went around buying up portfolios of available patents, which he then enforces claims on. He's not really an innovator in any way, shape, or form, except possibly, arguably, culinarily. He's a big, modernist cuisine business. But we can talk about modernist cuisine later. But basically, he's a vampire. He sits there and he extracts rents on other people's innovation. In the Bay Area, I do not need to tell you, you see the first signs of a withdrawal from the commons, a withdrawal from the public sphere of the people who are most fluent with these technologies, most comfortable with them, and for whom the technologies in some ways are designed to extend. I would even argue that we're beginning to see the segregation of plays, of almost mutually incomprehensible and incompatible cohorts of people moving through the same space at the same time, but having very little relation with one another except potentially out of exploitation and mutual incomprehension. We've seen increasingly physically secured enclaves. This is possibly the most science fictional place I've ever been to in my entire life. It's called the Canyon. It's a mall in Istanbul. There is a public transit stop. There is a subway stop at the Canyon Mall. But you immediately move through a metal detector and a security check at that entrance. And that's sufficient to basically announce to all and sundry that really only come here if you have money to spend. It's just enough of a friction, there's a gradient of access. And once you get inside the mall, trust me, there's nowhere to sit down. Literally every single piece of ground that you might want to put your ass on is revenue generating for somebody. When my partner and I went there, we packed sandwiches from the hotel buffet the morning before, because we're like that. And we literally, we just looked everywhere we wanted to sit down and eat, we were chased away from. So I, at least, would argue that information technology, instead of being sort of wellspring of utopian values, has in our time become the handmaiden of capital. And if we are to talk about the tale of technology in our time, it's going to be the handmaiden's tale. I think that technology, information, networked digital information technologies are, by hook or by crook, beginning to reorient the world in a way that is comfortable, congenial, useful, and legible, not to the multitude, and not even to the elite, the human elite, but increasingly the world is tuned for the needs and predilections and requirements of an entirely different set of actors, a post-human set of actors. And I call that circumstance the post-human everyday. And that's kind of what the book is about. The book is an attempt to investigate the conditions of the post-human everyday. In the book, I deal with a bunch of different discrete technologies, some of the ones that I've found most salient. And we start with the smartphone, which I'm not going to discuss today. The smartphone is kind of a palate cleanser, because we all, I would like to see a show of hands. Who in this room has a smartphone? Okay? So, effectively universal, at least within certain populations. Increasingly universal on the planet, as a matter of fact. Something like 65% now of every adult on the planet has a smartphone, although the gradients of access are sharply circumscribed in other ways in other locations. For example, in India, something like 80% of adult men, but only 20% of adult women have access to a smartphone. So I don't want to assert a blanket universality, but I will say they're all pretty familiar with the smartphone, and that's why I literally tear it apart in the first chapter and ask what it portends for us. How does it work? What is it made of? I do a kind of a material, hopefully material lyrical investigation of this. But then we move into a bunch of other technologies that are increasingly less familiar to us and possibly less legible to us. We talk about things like augmented reality, the so-called Internet of Things, cryptocurrency and the blockchain, digital fabrication, which is to say 3D printing, and then a whole complex of states of affairs that are oriented around the ideas of automation, big data, analytics, ultimately artificial intelligence, but all of these things cluster around the idea of the eclipse of human discretion. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing a couple of these technologies. We're not going to get into too terribly much detail, and I'm aware that I'm likely to sort of aggravate your desire to discuss these things rather than provide any particularly comprehensive overview of them. But today we're going to talk about the Internet of Things, digital fabrication, the blockchain, and some of these ideas around automation. So let's talk about the Internet of Things. What on earth is the Internet of Things? Well, I would argue to you that it appears to us, or it appears in our lives at three scales. At the scale of the body, it appears as a discourse around the quantified self. The notion that the human body itself is now a terrain for the capture of metrics about our performance and the optimization of our movement through the world through literally wearable sensors and increasingly things which are conjoined with our own physical bodies. At the scale of the room, this appears to us as something called the smart home. Now we see these branded, broadly gendered virtual assistants, which are spoken language, so they're natural language interfaces that sit in the home. And they're the front end onto extraordinarily elaborate apparatuses of data capture, data analysis, back-end services, all of which reside on the cloud and appear to us in only this physical form. And then at the scale of public space or the city more broadly, these discourses appear to us as a rhetoric, embodied rhetoric around the smart city. And what we see here on the screen is the $40 million control room that the IBM Corporation built for the city of Rio de Janeiro. It's what's called the Fusion Center. So this is a place where information from sensor grids and networks, from the smartphone networks, from CCTV cameras, are all brought into this one facility and provided for the use of the administrators of the city. So if you know anything at all about the way the information technologies are kind of stuck together with one another, you might be familiar with an idea called the API, the Application Programming Interface. An application programming interface is a structured conduit that allows one piece of hardware or software to talk to another. And the fact of the matter is that the cost of engineering an API is extraordinarily low compared to the cost of developing a center like this and all the analytical software that it uses to model the city's behavior at real time. If you wanted to provide all of us, all of the users of the city, all of the citizens of a place with access to those analytics, it wouldn't be incrementally that much trouble to develop an API that forwarded this information to the public. The fact of the matter that this investment was made without any such API like that ever having been designed or developed tells me something very specific about who was intended to benefit from this information and this analytical production, and it's not us. So, the quantified self, the smart home, the smart city, what are the intentions behind these productions of technology? I would say to inscribe network informatics in every object, surface, and relation of everyday life. But that's not really a motive. Beneath that, we have things like the computational extraction of value from everyday activity, or the desire to optimize performance, which is always against a highly particular but rarely specified set of criteria. The will to remote observation, control, and ultimately a kind of a God's eye view over events, a sort of watchfulness from above. So a second ago I mentioned that the computational extraction of value from everyday activity is one of the motives behind this. What does that look like? This is a screenshot from a piece of software which is now a couple of years old. As a matter of fact, this is hugely obsolete at this point. This is a French analytical package called Qui Vidi, which is Latin for who sees. It sits behind the image stream flowing up from the CCTV camera. And I don't know if the resolution or the contrast, can you see that there's some blue circles and some red circles?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what Qui Vidi is attempting to do is identify the gender of people passing in front of the camera. And for humanities scholars, and I think people with an ordinary complement of goodwill and awareness, in 2017 we understand that, to quote Judith Butler, gender is a performance. That's not what QED does when it identifies us as, by the way, binary, either male or female. It's looking at the index of 81 separate bone measurements of distances in the face, and it's assigning people to one or another bucket. And the reason that it's doing that is, again, the extraction of value. It's trying to identify people not merely by gender, but by age band, by ethnicity, and by bouncing light off their eyeballs, an attention index, whether they're actually attending to the commercial that's on the screen behind this camera. And the reason for that is simple. We are not equally valuable as targets for advertising. And so by measuring who precisely is attending to an advertising at any given time, differentially valuable rates can be applied to that, and new commercials can be developed that are more closely targeted to desirable pools of individuals. I would argue that this class of technology treats us not as subjects, not as citizens, but in fact as operands, as things that are operated upon. This is an image provided by a civil rights organization in Chicago, which was concerned about something called the heat list. The heat list is an algorithmic tool that's used by the Chicago Police Department that assesses now it's 1,200 people they believe are most likely to participate in violent crime in the city of Chicago, either as victims or as perpetrators of that crime. It will not surprise you that they will not discuss what criteria they use to put people on this heat list. It will probably also not surprise you that the overwhelming majority of people on this list are young black men. And it gives each one of them a score. And if your score reaches a certain threshold, the Chicago Police Department has a program with the most beautifully Orwellian title I've ever heard of. The program is entitled Custom Notifications. And what that means is that somebody from CPD goes and knocks on your door. Now, an algorithm is here assessing you as having a likelihood of being involved in a violent crime in the future. But you have not necessarily done anything at all yet to warrant this intervention, this interference in your life. And this is armed agents of the state showing up literally at your front door and asking you to be let into your home to have a brief conversation with you. And this is the explicit aim of the heat list, the algorithm that was developed as a part of what's called preventive policing. So we have this desire to model complex urban dynamics ahead of real time, so administrators can intervene in anticipation of preemption of events, and I again want to highlight that. And the thing about all of this is, there's this saying, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing us he didn't exist. All of this is offered to us as simply natural, simply the product of neutral technical evolution. This is innovation, this is increased efficiency, this is cost efficiency for the police. Never mind any of the other effects it has on us, never mind any of the effects it has on our ability to act as subjects or as citizens of democracy. It's across the board, in the advertisements, in the op-ed columns, in the talking heads on the TV talk shows. This is simply what an enlightened city in the 21st century does if it wants to remain ahead of the curve. These are the investments that are made. And I find that the discussion of the values that are embedded in these technologies disturbing enough. There's never any discussion of that. But you know what else we never discuss? And for those of you who don't happen to share my particular politics, this might raise a few of your hackles as well. There's never any discussion of return on investment. There's never, for all of the arguments that are made about the notion this is a more cost-effective way to do things, nobody yet has any actual metrics and cost savings. And I pay fairly close attention to this rhetoric. You constantly hear about what could be done, what might be done, what will be done, but almost never about what actually has been done. The one case study that everybody can point to that has any kind of cost return is the traffic light system in Copenhagen. And people trot that out constantly because it's all they have available to them. So that is, for the time being, our discussion of enduring things. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about digital fabrication. Now, digital fabrication was consciously, at least 3D printing. I want to be very specific when I say digital fabrication. We could be talking about computer numerically controlled milling. We could be talking about laser cutting. For the moment, I want to confine my comments to 3D printing out of plastic filament. And this was a technology that was very specifically designed to rethink the way that people have access to the means of making things. This is RepRap, a replicating, no, a
Replicating rapid prototyping.
bless you, thank you. Self-replicating rapid prototyping machine, which was developed by an engineering professor named Adrian Boger. And the idea of it isn't that it's simply a 3D printer that can make whatever digital file you feed to it and feed out some fabricated artifact, but that most of the components of the machine itself are in fact fabricable on the machine itself. So it is not merely a means of production, it's nominally a distributed means of production. This is the parent machine, this is the child machine. This child machine was produced using the parent machine. And the idea here was very much that the commodity form was going to be undermined by the massive distribution of these machines in the world. That everybody would have one. That everybody, the first thing you do when you got one was make one for your neighbor. So that there would be literally on the order of tens of millions of machines in the world. And any artifact that you thought, that we might want to buy, the economics of scale would be such that it would be cheaper to make it at home. That was the idea behind this vision, and I frankly find this a very, very attractive way of thinking of the world. As a matter of fact, if you suggest to me that you could take digital fabrication technologies, so not merely a 3D printer like a RepRap, but a CNC milling machine and a laser cutter, and if you could use them with repositories of freely downloadable specifications, so somewhere online there'd be a repository and you'd say, hey, I need, the little grommet on my shoe just popped out. And, it's either $25 to buy a new set of, I'm dating myself, $125 for a new pair of sneakers, or I can fabricate a 15-cent component locally. And oh, by the way, here's the specification for that component free, available to download, licensed for my use. If you could take those two things, if you could deploy them in clean city center workshops at human scale, if those workshops could themselves be placed under democratic community control, so the investments in what particular technologies to invest in were made at the level of the community. And if these things could be devoted to an ethic of repair, I think you've got something really interesting going on. The image on the screen is an internal combustion engine, which was about to be scrapped forever because this component eventually wore down. So this entire machine, complex machine, with all of the material, energetic, and financial investment that was involved in it and its production was going to be scrapped for the want of literally a 25-cent piece of material. This is the motor mount. And somebody found a specification for the appropriately sized motor mount on one of those repositories. They fabbed it out. And to my knowledge, when I got in touch with this Thingiverse user last, it was 3 years after the photo had been uploaded and the motor was still running. So this is the kind of thing that is possible in a world where there's massively distributed digital fabrication under community control. And I think not merely repair, but ultimately it's self-reliance, where we could fabricate more and more of the things that we needed in everyday life. For ourselves, these are volunteers for an amazing initiative called the Red Book Initiative, which teaches local community people how to install their own mesh wireless networks on rooftops. You can see here that they're handling an antenna mast, which on the open market probably costs them, I'd say, $50. But if you could fabricate that same part again for, maybe at scale, $3 to $4, you can see how much more accessible these technologies get to much greater bodies of people. And it's not simply components anymore either. 3D printing as a technology has advanced to the stage that we're now fabricating building scale elements directly on concrete printers. And you can, service the needs of a population that is in acute need of housing in short order. This is a Shanghai company that literally printed and built these houses in about a day. So, that's, to me, radical in the best possible sense. But I wouldn't be me if I didn't look to the unintended consequence. This sort of what we call disruptive innovation. In the Valley, in the body of business discourse that surrounds the Valley, disruptive innovation is never questioned. It's simply the move fast and break things school of technological development. And, you know, that's great if you can build a house in a day at extremely low cost. But the trouble is that you're not just dropping that house into a vacuum, you're dropping it into a community, into a human environment, as well as a physical environment. And what gets disrupted might be an ecosystem that functions in ways that are completely opaque to an innovator. So, for example, when folks from MIT propose going to the slums of India or the favelas of Rio, and, you know, well, instead of the houses that you build yourself, we're gonna print you these, you know, fancy new houses with our 3D printer. Well, one of the things that they're doing is that they're disrupting the economy of the community, because a significant amount of the money that flows into the community is earned by these gentlemen. They're the ones who fabricate pieces for the houses themselves out of scrap aluminum and tin and anything that they can basically repurpose from the trash heaps. These guys make their living doing this. When you propose to innovate, to disruptively innovate, you are not merely taking away their livelihood, but their sense of themselves and what they contribute to the community. So again, there's this sort of recourse to expert knowledge instead of local practical knowledge. There's also the case that, you know, these devices still don't come cheap. I would say a decent CNC milling machine tabletop scale that you can fabricate components of about the scale of the ones that are in this chair. You know, that's still going to run you $1,500. That is an order of magnitude improvement over just a couple of years ago, but it's still clearly wildly out of reach for most of the people on the planet. Using these things assumes a knowledge base. This is, you know, you can't just fab yourself out a rep wrap and get going on it that same day. You have to understand a little bit about the properties and the qualities of the materials you're working with, and it helps to have some kind of knowledge of, you know, the tensile strength and the engineering properties of what you're building with. It isn't simply you can just download something yet and drop it into place and it's going to work. And finally, the notion of open source itself is contested. So when we talk about these repositories being licensed for free use, well, that free there is in itself a site of a fair amount of controversy. And there are things which disappear from these repositories all the time because somebody feels like the design is not being used in a way that's consonant with their original intention or the intention that's behind their license. So what we wind up with is a case in which when you drop this technology into the world, at least in this first 10 to 15 year period, it may very well be the case that things change later on down the road, but for now, this technology is most appealing in its commoditized form. When you buy it as not something that you replicate yourself, but a product. A product, I mean, you know, wasn't this whole thing designed so that we wouldn't have to buy commodified products with brands on them, and yet that's where we wound up. And do you know what we mostly make with these things? The red object on the print stage gives a fairly significant hint. We're not, for the most part, fabricating motor mounts for our deadline or internal combustion engines. We're not fabricating, you know, valves for our stents or things that might be practical. A lot of what gets fabricated is cruft, is kitsch, is, you know, objects that, in my opinion, contribute relatively little value to the world. So here's an example of a case in which, at least in the present term and into the reasonably foreseeable future of the next couple of years, you have a technology which was designed with the intention of undermining the economics of scarcity, you know, not a trivial ambition, and on paper has everything it needs to serve that ambition. And yet, when it runs up against what Jane Bennett calls the social intractability of the material world, doesn't perform that way at all. As a matter of fact, performs in a way that's opposite to the intention of its designer. And the same thing is true of the technologies that are broadly gathered up under the heading of the blockchain. I'm going to ask for a show of hands again, because this is thorny territory. How many people know what a blockchain is? All right. I'm going to go into a slightly remedial, very quick, very high level overview of what the blockchain is. Another show of hands. Who's heard of Bitcoin? Okay, great, fantastic. Okay. Bitcoin was designed to be a digital currency, a currency that worked on something called a trustless architecture. And And the reason was that it was trustless, was that in the modern era of currency, in addition to the psychological sleight of hand that's played on us at the time we're discussing a store of value, that we need to kind of believe that it has value at mass. It's essentially a consensual hallucination at scale that money has value at all. The guarantor of the value of currency has ordinarily been an institution of state in the modern era. It's ordinarily been a government, a central bank or mint that guarantees the value of legal tender. That is on its face offensive to a particular class of people that characterize themselves mostly as anarcho-capitalists or as techno-libertarians. They do not trust the state, they do not believe the state has the right to interfere in the affairs of private sovereign individuals. And they would like as much as possible to find modes of value exchange that are secure, that are as closely as possible anonymous, that are yet persistent, and that do not require the intervention of a private bank or any kind of trusted intermediary. They would want all value exchange to be peer-to-peer. The method that was eventually devised to accomplish this over many years was something called the blockchain. The blockchain is the innovation that is at the heart of the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. And it essentially means that every Bitcoin, every individual Bitcoin that is created has an address. And everybody who holds Bitcoin has something called a wallet, which also has an address. So in principle, the entire network knows the origin and trajectory through space and time of every Bitcoin that was ever mined and minted. It knows that I had one and I gave it to Nick in exchange for something. Now, our identities, great guy, you do not necessarily need to know our identities. You need to know merely our wallet addresses. An extraordinarily complicated series of distributed calculations are performed across all of the computers on the Bitcoin network to verify this transaction, to verify that I had that coin originally so that I had the right to spend it, that it was a valid coin, and that he received it. Long story short, if you perform this operation about 6 times over, it eventually mathematically acquires a property that you would need more than 51% of the entire Bitcoin network to collude on a falsification of it, for it not to be a valid exchange. Historically, there have been so many Bitcoin mining computers and they've been so widely distributed that the odds that anybody would be able to concentrate 51% of that network were extremely low. So after 6 10-minute cycles of mining, we can be reasonably certain that this transaction was valid and would never be invalidated. This is the trustless architecture of the network. The way in which that calculation is distributed across the network is called distributed consensus. And here is the problem with Bitcoin and the blockchain and all of the technologies that have now been developed on top of the blockchain, which is that distributed consensus means something very different in the context of cryptocurrency operations than it does perhaps as a common sense module of language in the English language. For most political people, in particular, horizontalist, participatory, left-wing people, when they hear distributed consensus, they're like, well, that's all right. That's exactly what we're after. We believe in distributed consensus. So this technology is the best thing since sliced bread. And the trouble is that, again, the people who develop this technology are anarcho-capitalists who are not necessarily interested in anything that I would regard as left-wing politics. They do want to erode the state. They want the state to cease to exist. But they want the state, perhaps like Steve Bannon, they want the state to cease to exist without anything necessarily replacing it. They want simply for the world, for society, as Margaret Thatcher suggested, for society to evaporate, and for the world to be constructed merely of peer-to-peer relations between sovereign individuals, not overseen by any authority. This is Vitalik Buterin, who was, I think, 19 when he left Waterloo University, spurred on by a $100,000 stipend by Peter Thiel to develop a second-generation blockchain. So the Bitcoin blockchain was not Turing complete, it was not computationally complete, it was intentionally limited in terms of its computational power. And in particular, it lacked the property known as recursion. It could not perform operations back on itself. The blockchain that Buterin developed was Turing complete. So weirdly enough, this is essentially a computer as code which lives across the network. It is a distributed computer, and you can do anything with that computer that you could do with any other computer. So one of the things you could do with that computer is what's called a smart contract, which is again, it's a very deceptive name. A smart contract is structurally more like a bet than it is like a contract. Basically, it's a black box that contains some agreed sum of value. And if a pre-described set of contingencies should arise and be authenticated to the blockchain network, the Ethereum network, that black box will open up and release whatever stored value is inside it to wherever it's supposed to go to. That's how they want to wire the world together. Now, that is not the way that most activists who have been involved in participatory horizontal politics understand distributed consensus to operate. So when you talk about a world that is constructed on the blockchain, a world of smart property, where literally, very granularly, and this is another appearance of the Internet of Things, where blockchain-mediated exchanges of value and microtransactions are required even to enter a simple door. When you talk about a world woven together of smart contracts, this is a world that is very specifically, very highly political, a very particular set of values that most people who use the blockchain have little idea that they're inscribing by reference to everything that's done with the blockchain. I also want you to attend, these things are not incidental. Look at the imagery around this stuff. It is invariably, I'm sorry, it is, it's white male hands that are doing this stuff. I mean, you know, these are the people who have developed this, and they've developed it for themselves in a way that makes them comfortable. It really is contracts all the way down. And this becomes super salient when we talk about the organization of arbitrarily distributed people into functional organizations. The outcome of the second generation blockchain is something called the DAO, the DAO, the Distributed Autonomous Organization. It's essentially a corporation that lives in code. And it can do anything that a corporation can do. It can own property, smart property or dumb property. It can have employees, including human employees. It can enter into contracts. But the really interesting thing about the DAO is that of its shareholders, any number of them might be autonomous modules of code. They might be non-human. They might be purposive, designing, self-optimizing, but not human. But they might own a table. They might own a plot of real estate. They might be able to control access to that real estate. All of which is done now in a way that's completely free from human oversight. In fact, has escaped the possibility of human understanding. And here we make a sharp turn toward the post-human. And the final technology that I'd like to discuss with you today are a class of technologies that's oriented around automation, algorithmic data analysis, machine learning, so-called deep learning, and artificial intelligence. We enter, of course, the prospect of a world without work. This is a map that was published by NPR last year that really made me understand what the economic impact of automation is going to be. And I'm not even talking about factory automation, and I'm not necessarily talking about the kind of automation that you can see at McDonald's where jobs are being eliminated by the responsibilization of the user interaction there, where you've got interactive kiosks instead of human beings. The words you see on the screen are the number one revenue generating class of employment in each particular state. And as you can see, in state after state after state, that class of employment is truck driver. And when you understand that it is easier to automate the operation of freight trucks on the relatively less complex environment of an interstate than it is to automate driving in urban terrain, you understand just how quickly automation is going to fall back against the economy with just what kind of decisive results. I mean, as far back as the mid-20s, Keynes was talking about technological and automation and unemployment. I think we've reached a place where we really now have to sort of price those models in to the way we think about the operations of the entire economy. Because it's going to be, Israel is a radical understatement. I'm not really gonna get into that though, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there so we understand what the scale is and the impact of all this. I wanna talk about something that I find even more kind of mind-blowing and redolent with potential and hope, but also literally the transformation of the world out of all recognition. And that's this insight, that when you can abstract from any human activity the essence of it as an instruction set, and that instruction set comes to live on the network in a way that it can be traded from machine to machine to machine, you enter into a very interesting state of affairs. Now, how would you abstract, say, the skill of a master swordsman in a way that could be reduced to a portable, machine-readable instruction set? Well, you would take a sword master who had practiced at the highest level of his art for 28 years, and you would have him wear a motion capture suit for, several thousand hours of motion capture recording, including the tip of his sword. And you would transfer that to an industrial robot hero, Yaskawa Motoman MH24 industrial manipulator. The interesting thing here is that this was called the Bushido Project. This was something that was done by a Japanese industrial robotics concern. And the interesting thing for me is that Bushido means the way of the warrior. As a matter of fact, Japanese arts that end in the suffix do, like aedo, the art of drawing the sword from a sheath. These are considered to be spiritual practices. These are considered to be things which are have an aspect of the ineffable to them. So that when Isao Machi, the sword master that we see here, practices his art, he's ultimately, literally and without hyperbole and fetishization, this is what he thinks he's doing. He is ultimately trying to express the flow of the energy in the universe as it moves through him and the tip of his sword. And this was used politically by the Imperial Japanese government over the course of the 20th century. The notion of Bushido and its attendant notions of honor and service and self-sacrifice, an extraordinarily heavy and freighted notion which was deployed in Japanese internal affairs to suppress, say, opposition to the Second World War or to colonization of China or Korea. But none of that matters when all of the operations, the physical operations of that swordcraft are transferred to a robot, which can then perform the 10,000 cuts as well or better than any human sword master, and can do so from the moment that that instruction set is loaded into its processor. If that seems a little bit crude and deterministic, consider the defeat last year of Lee Sedol, the Go master, by DeepMind, Google Artificial Intelligence. The way that Lee was beaten at the game of Go is interesting because it implies a development in artificial intelligence over the last, say, 15, 20 years or so. Before the turn of the century, Deep Blue, an earlier generation of IBM artificial intelligence, beat a chess grandmaster, and chess was considered to have been solved. The way that chess computer did so was simply brute force. It simply attacked. It's true that we progressively redefine artificial intelligence as we achieve certain things, but you could say that that's just mechanical. The way that Go was defeated was different. Two separate sorts of machine learning algorithms set to work playing games of Go. There was a policy network and I've forgotten the name of the other network. They collaborated. They were essentially learning modules that fought against each other and got better all the time. They could play tens of thousands of games in a single 24-hour period. So even during the games of the 5-game match that took place in Seoul, DeepMind was learning. It was constantly improving. And even though the decision space of Go is, it's one of those numbers that the only set of metaphors we have for them are things like, the number of possible moves in Go is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. You can't use that simple mechanistic brute force approach to it. DeepMind had to teach itself the rules of the game, to learn from them, to learn what strategies would achieve victory. And when it finally beat me, the move that it used was so counterintuitive that no human player ever would have played it. As a matter of fact, if you're a student of Go, it was considered to be extremely inesthetic, clumsy move. One observer, who was a highly ranked Go player themselves, said it made them physically unwell to see that move. Because they thought, there's an intelligence operating here that I cannot sound, that I cannot countenance, that I cannot understand. And maybe that doesn't convince you that most human affairs are now open to algorithmic learning and reproduction. How about this? The image you see on the screen was generated by an algorithm and a 3D printer, actually, because there's a print depth involved. This is a project called Next Rembrandt. The entire corpus of Rembrandt's existing confirmed paintings was fed into a series of algorithms that determine things like what is the most common human subject of a Rembrandt. Well, it's a white male in early middle age turning to the right. The hair color, the light in the room. Again, Rembrandt never painted this. This never existed until an algorithm magicked this out of a space of possibility based on everything that it had learned about what constituted the archetype of Rembrandt. Now, and again, the way that it was printed on 3D, apparently that the canvas itself has a texture that allows it to mediate light in the same way that a Rembrandt hanging in a museum would. If you shuffle this image into a stack of, confirmed known Rembrandts, I would not have been able to pick it out as the one that was generated from a rule set. So here we see, and it really doesn't matter what expressive medium we're talking about. All of us, in whatever our expressive or creative medium is, patterns. Patterns are what we use. Patterns are what we know. Patterns are what we come back to. It doesn't matter if you're talking about James Joyce or Nina Simone or Ruth Asawa. It doesn't matter what field or human endeavor. These patterns constitute a corpus. These patterns can be abstracted. They can be learned. They can be communicated across the network from machine to machine. And then they can then improvise on them. And what we arrive at eventually is a world in which creativity itself has escaped the bounds of the human. What does that look like? Well, it may look like this. This is a bracket that was subjected to a before and after process of topological optimization for strength to weight ratio. So it's just a machine component that's designed to hold two other components together. The before, I wish I had an image to show you. The before looks completely conventional. It's just like a little cylinder with little holes where you mount screws and screw it onto something. And you might find these things $1,000 to $1 at the local hardware store. You look at them, you kind of intuitively know immediately what it was for. Then the process of topological optimization, the algorithm is applied to it, and this is the design that emerges thereafter. Now, this is nothing and this is like the Go move. This is nothing that any human being ever would have designed. I find it Lovecraftian. I find it like kind of uncanny and vaguely disturbing.
It's more like Giger to me.
And Giger, these are the references, right? These are the references that pop out at us. I find this vaguely disturbing. I find it's disturbing to look on. I can guarantee you that it is more fit for purpose than anything any of us would ever have come up with. It is the optimal way of distributing and enveloping forces against a given quantity of matter. It is hard to improve on this. Imagine a world that is made entirely of shapes like this. At the very simplest level, forget about all the ethics, forget about everything else. Just imagine that this is the shape of the world as it faces us. Is it tuned for us anymore? Or is it tuned for the needs of another subject, a post-human subject? And I think this is where we are now. I think it's critical, and I'm going to try and wrap up here so we can have some time to talk. it's critical to remember that someone designed these systems invariably to produce some desired set of outcomes. So what I would ask is that we learn to see the all too human behind every appearance of the post-human. There is always a human motivation behind every appearance of these technologies. And I would argue that they're generally fairly shabby motivations. As a matter of fact, I would say your future movie is a sharpening scheme, as the sexist would say. Without belaboring the point, I regard most of these technologies as alienation engines which produce moments of howling fatuity, which are really dedicated to the concretization of some really surprisingly lame adolescent including the fantasy of unlimited strength, including the fantasy of control over our fractious and humiliating bodies, including the fantasy of escape from the charnel house we've made of the planet's surface, including the fantasy of transcendence beyond the limits of the human. But I kind of feel like there will be no escape, and there will be no transcendence, because we cannot escape ourselves and what it is that we will to do with technologies. As a matter of fact, the world's complexity confounds intention. The image on the screen is a metaphor that I come back to in the book. It is concrete tetrapods which have been dumped across 55% of the coasts of Japan. So 55% of the Japanese coastline looks like this. And they were dumped there nominally in an effort to reduce erosion. Now, as it happens, the tetrapods do generate some benefits. They are a prime subsidy to the Japanese concrete industry, and they provide a very healthy source so far of manual employment among the people who basically guide them down from the grains as they're lowered. So they do throw off some benefits. But as it happens, they don't do much to combat erosion, and in fact it's thought that they actually accelerate future erosion. So, so much for interested purposive intervention. It turns out that there's always a cost to our technologies, always already. The moment we talk about digital technology at all, as a matter of fact, you are implicit, you're complicit in some ways of using the world and the other human beings in the world that we need to take note of. We're complicit in the despoilation of the environment that tails off of things like, the nickel mines and the rare earth mines and the places where the tin and solder in our phones is fabricated. We're complicit in the exploitation of the people who labor to assemble these devices and bring them to market. My friend Jack Chu in Hong Kong has statistics that suggest that something like 10,000 fingers a month are avulsed, are amputated on the assembly lines of Shenzhen. I was not able to ascertain from him how many of those are eventually attached. But, this is something that we're complicit in. So I would like to offer a different vision of technology. And instead, we ought to be designing our technologies so that there's a little bit of wiggle in them, so that they can adapt more readily to the contingencies that they face in the world, not merely material and energetic, but the human as well. We should be designing from the beginning for adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse, as in this here's a scooter in India that's being used to drive a well. Adaptive reuse at every scale. So here's Tara David in Caracas, very famously a skyscraper bank building whose developers went bankrupt in the course of completing it, and was thereafter turned into the world's largest vertical squat. Every single one of those spaces was filled in by a separate family as an apartment. Improvisation we should be trying to afford with our technologies, and repair, as in every culture on earth used to know how to repair, used to understand the value of repair before we got to the commodification era. And we need to be asking questions about our encounter of technology, like what does this work make of us? What sorts of capabilities does it call forth in us, and alternatively, what sorts of capabilities does it tend to suppress in its presence? How can we make technology more invitational so more people feel that they are authorized to get their hands dirty, to understand how it works? What kinds of worlds can we build with it so that ultimately we arrive in a place that's congenial to our deepest and highest values, and not our shallowest and most shabby ones? A world that looks not like this, not like the gleaming, perfect, a priori, perfectly functioning world of the smart city and the smart home and the quantified self, but actually looks a lot more like this, like a community garden. It's kind of messy and contentious, something that's unfinished and never will be finished, but it's a place where things are growing. Those things have value, utility, and worth. They are things that signify to us as humans, and ultimately, in the end, I believe they are beautiful things. This, I would have, in the past, regarded as a potential that is available to us within the field of technology. But this word potential is kind of problematic. A few years ago, a friend of mine took me to task for discussing potentials. He said that he had been reading in the early Bruno Latour, and what he concluded from that reading was that there's no such thing as potential. So when people say, this technology can do this, it might do this, it should, it will, it ought to, that is essentially a fiction. There's only states of the system which have been enacted and states of the system which have not yet been enacted. And if you want to enact some future, if you want to predict the future by inventing it, you have to put the work into making that a reality. You have to invest the time, the energy, the effort in proving out that that state of the system was in fact possible. You know, I think my sense is, my gut sense, I've worked in technology as long as I have, this should have been our goal right now. And not just a few, but for everyone. And I will tell you honestly that with everything that's in me, I believe it still can be, but it requires that work. So let's work together on that. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm sorry I ran so long.
No, that's great. Thank everyone for their patience. I will start right off with questions. Yeah.
Thank you. You offer a vision for technologists and designers to sort of provide a counterweight to some of the tendencies that you found out. I'm going to ask a broader political question, which are, do you see any possibilities, and what are the possibilities for resistance, even on the level of everyday life, for people who would be operands as opposed to designers?
Yeah, that's something that I do explicitly take on the book. I think of it in three ways. There's enunciation, resistance, and I think that each one of those presents us with a different envelope of possibilities. I do think it's too late to renounce the effect of these technologies at all, unless we're literally willing to do the Kaczynski thing of go entirely off-grid and move to a cabin somewhere. And I think we would find even that being the case, that we were subject to the operations of our presence as a recruiter in the apparatus of control that we developed around us. The question of resistance is the next one to me, because you're already operating on somebody else's home turf. I think that I have enormous respect for people like the Radical Network Conference, for people like TFLAT, for people who are doing this work right now. But I think that all too often they wind up embracing the framing assumptions of a hegemonic culture that are deeply inimical to the values that they themselves would want to further in the world. I think that there's a lot of ways in which there's tacit values that are so deep in some of these technologies, and not really values either, but for example, physical outcomes like the pollution and the exploitation. I think the moment you use digital technology, you're entering into those contracts. I think that the moment you use digital technology, you are acceding to a gradient of access where it's very simply not everybody will ever understand how to use these, will ever have access to them, and might not want to. So all I ask for myself is that having started in the hole, as it were, that you get something of extremely high value out of your use of these technologies. I think there is, certainly for psychic reasons, there's an imperative to resist. The material that can be achieved with it. I had so much hope around the blockchain until I went to TV. And, that was literally like a year and a half after I had started talking about that technology. I really looked into the assumptions that were baked into it by the people who designed it, and then how specifically they designed it to enact their desires. So I think that it requires a lot of diligence on the part of people who are going to use technologies and motion resistance. And practically speaking, not everybody has the energy to do that. It's a big ask. So, I mean, I would personally devote the rest of my life to doing what you suggest and to trying to organize people to do the same. But I'm under no illusion that the people who will be doing that will not constantly be outraced by more powerful, better leveraged, better equipped forces with other people who are on Earth. The history of life on Earth is full of sudden reversals and crashes and unexpected victors of outcomes. So I'm not without hope by any stretch of the imagination. I just think that we need to have an understanding of exactly what the odds are that confront us when we do this work. I think that's a reasonably satisfactory answer.
Thank you. Partly from your other conversations besides here, I know that you've looked at horizontal peer high delivery organizations or spontaneous groups. And I would include things maybe, and that's just to check with you, things like deliberative juries, things like participatory budgeting. So it's a two-part question. One is that a vehicle for reform? And then two, I've done a bunch of those.
Yeah.
And they're great.
Yeah.
And they liberate the people who are in them.
Yes.
And the people who are not there go, what? What? You did what? You know, they don't get it. And I thought about, well, maybe an appropriate role of technology is to create the participation gradient such that I'm not in your deliberative jury, but I know enough about it to care and agree that it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think ultimately it's the best way I have of answering your question. What attracted us to Occupy Sandy was that, when we got there, immediately somebody put us to work. I mean, it was a horizontal, like every cliche you can imagine about bottom-up horizontal activist organizations was blown away in that moment. There was a process that we entered into that, for the next couple of weeks of my life, I wound up being bodily involved in. And it was transformative for me. It was like I got outside of my ego, I got outside of my identity as whoever this person is that does this in books or in talks. And I was nearly, doing something effective to help people who are under a whole lot of stress. And that felt amazing. And I had the same instinct that you did. It's like, if more people got to do this more of the time, our politics would be very different. And so how do you get people to have that kind of insight directly, bodily, physically, in an active and lived way? My sense is that there's a role for technology to play in that, and a very important role. I mean, there were very important technologies at the heart of Occupy. They just weren't the technologies that get so much attention. They were completely unglamorous. And they were used in sort of adaptive ways. So the single technology that Occupy Sandy ran on was an Amazon wedding registry. The wedding registry of Sandy and Sandy. And people would buy gifts for Sandy and Sandy, and that's what would get delivered to the church that you're using as the distro site. That's a brilliant, if I can use the word hack, of an existing technology to produce different kinds of outcomes. And there's also a big Google spreadsheet that everybody involved used to coordinate things. These are like commodity technologies. They're robust. They're down the far side of the Gartner hype curve, if you know what the Gartner hype curve is. They're down deep in the trough of disillusionment. Most of the technologies that I get asked to comment on as either a designer or, again, a person doing whatever it is that I do, are like blockchain or automation. They're much sexier. They're much closer to the leading edge of development. And my sense is that the distributed technologies that we will use to catalyze the kinds of resistant activity that I do believe in that will result in more people having direct access to these experiences are ones that the Red Book Initiative is looking at. are ones that some of the people that are funded by the New America Foundation are looking at, but they're not at all on most people's radar. They're kind of vaguely embarrassing to talk about. You know, we've seen even recently that people are using faxes again to get in touch with their elected representatives, you know, in a way that kind of circumvents a lot of the policy controls that are placed on the efficacy of citizen engagement. And so if the fax can have value and utility in 2017, I hesitate to say that anything can't. I think that we just need to be careful about our assessment of those technologies and where we get a hold of them and how we use them. And I'm happy to discuss that at infinite length in any other context, because that's really what I feel like I need to do at this point. Thanks for questions, great questions.
Thank you for your talk, it's really fascinating, and we really look forward to the book as well. One thing that you didn't touch on today that I'm just curious about, it seemed like most of your examples were fairly rooted in the physical material world, or at least one level of abstraction, blockchain mediating transactions, owning a house, etc. I'm wondering if either in the book or in your other work or thinking you thought about things like virtual reality writ large. Because I think there's this kind of, we're at this weird precipice where you can go to any mall in America and go to the Microsoft store and strap on the virtual reality gear, but it's not yet mass consumer. And there are kind of very active proponents and opponents to it. You know, on the one hand, you've got the infinite jest WALL-E idiocracy version of just, you know, mindless diversion consumerism. But then you've got people like Charles Lanier who's saying things like, you know, this could be the revolution in consciousness, it's like psychedelic drugs, it could turn us into cephalopods. And even like serious journalistic exercise like New York Times VR, trying to put people in famine areas as aid packets are dropping. So I'm just curious, is this something you've explored and sort of thoughts you have on, and then the kind of, the real thing this week was like the working class men in America are spending fewer hours working and more hours playing video games, and they're significantly happier as a result. So that just kind of throws a curveball into this whole.
Yeah, I do. I have an entire chapter about augmented reality. I admit explicitly in the book that I give VR short shrift, and that is the chapter around which I expect to be longest. I mean, I think anytime you make assertions of this nature, public have to be prepared for reality to make a fool of you in the fullness of time. And God knows I've called a bunch of things wrong before. My sense, I'm very skeptical about augmenting virtual realities because they tend to erode the bedrock reality principle of a shared common destiny that reality reliably offers to us. I think that when we each retreat into the private universe that's offered to us by a programmed experience, there's something about the contestation of our desires in public space that I think completes us and makes us whole. And the more that we have experiences that don't have that quality to them, and they're strictly under our control in some kind of fully programmable, immersive environment, I worry about that. I worry about it both from the augmented reality side, even more so for the virtual reality side. As a matter of fact, I quote one of the most prominent VR developers as saying explicitly that since we can't distribute wealth evenly, and I'm going to try and quote this word for word, my memory's shit, but I think this is what he said, perhaps we can fabricate some portion of the desirable experiences of the wealthy and share them with a broader audience. And I'm like, if we lived in a better world, that would be the guillotine right there. That's the guillotine for giving that out loud. I can't honestly believe we said that out loud. I think that is, that's the calculus. Now, I also say in the book, my friend is a VR developer, so he was given access to some early stuff. And I felt beyond linear. I mean, I felt like a child. I felt in the best way. I mean, let me stipulate first, I dislike dogs intensely and I dislike robots intensely. And so, like, here I was interacting with a robot dog and I was laughing my head off. It was adorable. You know, it was like, I could wander through the orbit of Jupiter and pick up Jupiter and I could, you know, run over the shores of a glacier in Iceland. It was tremendous. And I think that I would be foolish if I underplayed the expressive potential of that space. I think there are works the equivalent of any of the great works of human history to be authored, possibly even collectively authored and experienced in those technologies. Do I think that most people, you know, will appreciate those? I look at the gaming industry pretty closely, and you don't want to make kind of a media determinist argument, because I think that's kind of naff, but I do think that there's if not a one-to-one correlation, there's some kind of correlation between the massive popularity of first-person shooters, the kinds of values you get around Gamergate, and the politics around the 2016 election, and that we've been contending with since. I think there's a connection between those things. I'm not willing to pin myself down to what I think that connection is, but that is my sense of things. And so, yeah, I don't know if that's a fair answer.
Instant gratification of magical things would be the commonality there.
Other questions? One, right here in the morning.
So I came in a few minutes late, so I'm not sure if you talked about this earlier. But your conclusion really points towards an idea in evolutionary biology called exaptation.
I've heard the term, yeah, but I'd love to hear your definition of it.
Yeah, so exaptation, which is not widely known, is basically a shift in function of any particular trait from its sort of naturally designed or adaptive purpose to a different purpose. And you know, the most famous example would be feathers in birds, naturally designed to keep birds warm, and then eventually exapted for use when birds begin to fly, or optimizes flight. And I think you're saying, specifically your conclusion, is pretty much spot on when it comes to exaptation. It's exapting these technologies for a different purpose than their originally intended purpose, if there ever was one.
There's a lot of, there is actually a good literature on exaptation in engineering and technology, and on specifically on Andreas Gardner, who's he's an evolution biologist who's written about robustness and evolvability in natural memory as operating on continuum analogous to each other. I think it's also important to understand that many of the technologies that I was talking about have already gone through multiple stages of acceptation, mostly from military industrial origins into consumer possibilities, things like that. Just the fact that something is being reused and repurposed does not in itself make that the use to which it's being repurposed inherently good or bad, or promoting one structure over another structure. I think what I would kind of amplify in Adam's argument in this context is the notion of there's a specific kind of repurposing that all these images were all, which are a kind of repurposing of something for use for which it was not originally intended, and often a use which is perpendicular to or counter to. So it's what the French philosophers would call détournement or something like that, versus pure.
So just one quick follow-up. So would you say then it's a logical sort of next step, or it's a totally separate thing that may not be?
I'd say it's contingent. It's hugely contingent. And in part, the reason that I do these talks is to humbly compute in whatever way I can to the likelihood that those technologies will be used towards the kinds of ends that I'm imagining. And I think a lot of people imagine, but unless somebody explicitly goes and says, hey, either propaganda for the league, here's a technology that I would actually use, or somewhat from this, saying there is this set of possibilities, let's see how many of them we can enact. I don't think that happens magically. I don't think it happens frictionlessly. I think it takes the
one last question.
Always a pleasure. I think, it's great to see you too. It's, every one of the talks that, I've seen of yours really kind of shakes me out of my comfort zone with respect to a lot of big questions I thought I had been thinking about. So I'm gonna try to connect a couple of dots and let's see where this goes. I wanna go back to the question someone asked before about the role of AR and VR and how those things will play out. And I think you alluded to the fact that, 3D fabrication ought to change the world and we're doing stupid things with it. I think that's kind of true of a lot of new media. And as long as there are enough good uses left over, I don't think I'm too worried about that. But the thing about AR and VR that I tied to what you said is toward the end, you spoke about how there's a trend and inherent in the uses of these technologies towards alienation. And how in many ways, the idea that we can cloudify or cut ourselves off from this reality that we're sharing here and in some sense inhabit our own reality, even if physically we're sharing space with other people, that is antithetical to the social evolution of the species. And I think there's kind of a straight line from Jane Jacobs' observations to ecosystems and cities that are opaque to the innovators, but they work because people actually do develop these relationships. There's a line from there through your own earlier work in urbanism and straight to the alienation point that you made. So my question is, and I do have one, given that thread, do you think there's a sense in which people who have shared those environments, have grown up in urban environments, are they any more or less attuned to some of the themes that you brought out compared to people who, for all practical purposes, have really spent their entire lives in some form of this alienated isolation? They've never had to they've never been forced to share physical space and come to grips with some of the things that you mentioned. Is there already a divide of that kind somewhere?
My most honest answer is that I wish there were, and that I would love to claim for urban people everywhere some kind of, advanced candiness. But when you walk down the street in any megacity, you see the same behavior. I mean, we saw driving into campus, where people were literally to stumble in front of the car because they were head down in their device, in the interface of their device, and not just one or
So
two.
we're all equally screwed.
But most, I mean, I would love to be able to say that city people, we're come on, you can't fool us, we've been around the block. No, I don't think that's the case. I think that
So we're on more equal footing than we realize, but it's poor footing.
yeah.
It's kind of that's the trend
Well,
here.
we go there.
I mean, I think there was a thread in what you're saying there. It was not necessarily that urban people are any smarter than rural people, but
That's not what I meant to imply.
but the cities themselves have a kind of smartness, but that it is a smartness that we rely on so much. I mean, this was Jane Jacobs' argument. We rely on the intelligence of that environment so much that we cannot see it. We have the luxury of taking it for granted and believing we only observe it by its absence.
Yeah, and going back to your question, I think that a lot of these technologies, mostly through ignorance rather than intent, cut against the things which make cities work for us, particularly the augmentation.
Right.
Because that was a couple of the examples you gave. I didn't want to burst in during your talk, but had I done so, I would have said, how much of this would you really attribute to sort of cynicism and malice on the part of the designers and actors versus just ignorance?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the Rio Control Center doesn't have APIs, but were they deliberately omitted, or did someone just not think of that?
I've actually asked them that question. So
What's
the
the
guys and they said and it goes to your point is, that's not what we're paid to do.
Yeah.
We just gave the client what they asked for. And so I think that there's it relates, interestingly to my discipline of architecture, which in which we for centuries, if not millennia, have been working on behalf of the powerful. And the ethics, though, in that process, though, there's been a kind of, it's sometimes vacant, it's sometimes often absent, but there is a kind of latent ethics to the profession. When the client is paying you to do something, you serve other populations as well. When you're doing a building in the city and the client tells you he wants it to be a black granite, shiny mausoleum with no entrances and to emit loud decibel sound, even if it was legal, as an architect, you'd say, I'm not comfortable with that, right? So, or we're not doing that, or you find a way, usually it's like the client is right, and you decide how they're right, and you finesse it. The interesting thing I come up against with, especially discussions of design in a technological background, not here at the Jacobs Institute, but often elsewhere, it's like, we can't be doing anything wrong, we're focused on the users. We're completely focused on the users, which is to say, In the case of technology, someone who's the person who's paying
You
for
can't
it.
define
So in terms of consumer technology, you know, maybe, okay, if I don't like this phone, I can maybe get another phone, even though there's not someone else who makes a decent phone, right? So there is some element of choice, but when it comes to the scale of infrastructure and the scale of cities, the people who are the paying for it are not the users. And the whole ethics of user-centered design, you know, evaporates because you can't, you know, because it's client-based.
So does the catchphrase, the new hacker ethic, mean anything to you? Is it a phrase you've heard?
Let's discuss that over.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess we're.
Yeah, so I would love to thank everyone so much for coming out.